My name is Liam. I'm 32 years old, and if you'd asked me a few years back whether I believed my own brother was capable of stabbing me in the back, I would have laughed. Sure, we'd had our sibling rivalries, the typical childhood fights over who got the bigger slice of cake or who got shotgun in the car, but betrayal. That was something I thought only happened in movies. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first time I noticed something was off was during family dinners. My then fiancée, Olivia, would sit beside me, and my brother, Ethan, always found an excuse to engage her in conversation. At first, I brushed it off. He was charming, funny, and social, and I figured he was just trying to be friendly. But then it started feeling excessive. Little touches on her arm when he made a joke, inside comments that I wasn't a part of, and the way she laughed just a little too hard at his stories. I told myself I was overthinking. After all, this was my brother. Growing up, Ethan had always been the golden child. He was 2 years older, taller, more athletic, and my parents doted on him. He was captain of the basketball team in high school, while I was more of a bookworm who kept to myself. At family gatherings, conversations always seemed to circle back to Ethan's accomplishments. My dad especially made no effort to hide his favoritism. "That's my boy," he'd say proudly whenever Ethan walked into a room. Me? I was the quiet one in the background, the dependable son who never caused trouble but never quite measured up either. When I met Olivia, I thought things were finally turning around for me. She was warm, supportive, and had this way of making me feel seen. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had something Ethan didn't, and maybe that's why he couldn't stand it. One evening, a few months before the wedding, we were at my parents' house for a casual get-together. I remember walking into the kitchen and catching Ethan whispering something to Olivia that made her cheeks flush. When I asked what was so funny, they both brushed it off with a vague inside joke. It stung, but I pushed the feeling down. The last thing I wanted was to sound paranoid, but paranoia turned into suspicion, and suspicion turned into certainty. I'll never forget the night Ethan came over uninvited. He was drinking, loud, and overly friendly with Olivia. At one point, when I left the room to grab drinks, I came back to find him leaning far too close to her, his hand on the back of her chair. Olivia laughed nervously and pulled away, but didn't outright stop him. That image burned into my memory. I confronted Olivia afterward, and she swore nothing was going on. "You know Ethan," she said. "He's just playful. Don't make something out of nothing." I wanted to believe her. I did believe her, at least I forced myself to, cause the alternative, that my brother and my fiancée might actually be crossing lines, was too painful to accept. Then, 5 years ago, everything fell apart. 2 weeks before the wedding, Olivia called me, her voice shaking. She said she couldn't go through with it. When I pressed for a reason, she hesitated, then finally admitted, "It's Ethan. I love him." The world crashed around me in that moment. I couldn't even find words. I just remember dropping the phone, sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall as if my brain had short-circuited. My own brother, my blood, and the woman I thought I'd spend my life with together. Ethan didn't even try to hide it. In fact, he flaunted it. He showed up at our parents' house the next weekend with Olivia on his arm, introducing her like she was some prize he'd won. "Guess I beat you at this one, too, little brother," he said with a smirk. My parents didn't say a word. They just looked uncomfortable, muttered something about family staying together, and acted like this wasn't the betrayal of a lifetime. That day, something inside me shifted. I realized that in my family's eyes, Ethan could do no wrong, even if he destroyed me in the process. And me? I was just expected to swallow it, to take the high road, to let it go for the sake of keeping the peace. For 5 years, I did just that. I walked away, built my own life, and cut contact as much as possible. But deep down, the wound never healed. Every holiday, every family gathering I skipped, every phone call I ignored was all a reminder of what they'd taken from me. And then came my father's funeral. I hadn't seen Ethan or Olivia in years, but I knew they'd be there. I prepared myself mentally for whatever smug comments or fake condolences they'd throw my way. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment they walked into the church, hand in hand, wedding bands flashing in the dim light. Ethan caught my eye immediately, his grin wide, triumphant, like he'd won some lifelong game between us. "Guess you're still alone, huh?" he whispered when he got close enough, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. I didn't react, not at first. I just gave him a small smile, the kind that made him frown in confusion. "Oh, really?" I said quietly, leaning in just enough so only he and Olivia could hear. "Have you met my wife yet?" Before they could respond, I gestured toward the back of the room where she was standing. And the second she started walking over, I watched their smiles vanish like smoke in the wind. That was the moment everything shifted again. When my wife, Sophia, walked toward us that day, Ethan and Olivia's expressions tightened in a way I'll never forget. Their earlier smugness slipped into something uglier. Olivia's face drained of color, and Ethan's jaw tensed, though he forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sophia greeted them warmly, extending her hand like the polite, gracious woman she is. But the air between the four of us was heavy, almost suffocating. "Sophia, this is my brother, Ethan," I said casually, "and his wife, Olivia." Sophia's smile didn't falter, but her eyes flickered, catching mine for just a moment. It was subtle, but she knew. She always knew when something wasn't right. Ethan gave her a limp handshake, and Olivia mumbled a quick hello before looking down at her shoes, her wedding band glinting in the light, as if mocking me. After the introductions, I excused us to take our seats. That was when the first whispers started. A few relatives leaned in, asking each other questions, their voices low but not low enough. "Who's she? When did Liam get married?" He never told anyone. The curiosity in their tone was sharp, almost invasive, like they weren't happy for me, but annoyed they'd been left out of the loop. That's the thing about my family. Privacy is treated like an offense, and independence is seen as rebellion. When Ethan got engaged, the entire family threw a massive party. Photos plastered across social media, toasts, and speeches about how proud my parents were. When I got married quietly with only a few close friends present, it was treated like a crime of omission. After the service, during the gathering at my parents' house, the tension boiled over. My aunt cornered me in the kitchen, clutching her glass of wine like it was her lifeline. "Liam," she said with a pointed look, "why wouldn't you tell us about your wife? Don't you think family deserves to know?" Before I could answer, Ethan strolled in, arms slung around Olivia, his voice loud enough for the whole room. "Guess some people just don't want their family involved in the big moments, huh? Not everyone understands what family loyalty means." The hypocrisy nearly knocked me off my feet. This was the same brother who had stolen my fiancée and paraded her in front of me, but now he was lecturing me about loyalty. I clenched my jaw, forcing a tight smile, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Olivia, emboldened by Ethan's words, chimed in with a brittle laugh. "It's okay, Ethan. Maybe Liam didn't think anyone would care." Her tone was syrupy, but the knife underneath was sharp enough to cut. My mother, who had been hovering nearby, sighed in that disappointed way only she could, shaking her head like I was a stubborn child. "You always did keep too many secrets, Liam. We're your family. We should have been there." No one said a word about Ethan parading his betrayal in front of me years ago. No one acknowledged the pain of what I'd endured. Instead, somehow, I was the problem again. Sophia, sensing my growing anger, slipped her hand into mine under the table later, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Don't let them get to you," she whispered. But how could I not? Every word felt like another reminder that in this family, Ethan could do no wrong, and I could do no right. The favoritism was suffocating. Ethan was being praised all night for how strong he was, handling Dad's passing while supporting his wife. At one point, my uncle actually said, "Ethan, you've always been the rock of this family." The rock? The same man who had crushed me to build himself up. Meanwhile, relatives kept pulling Sophia aside, asking invasive questions about where she was from, what she did, why no one had heard of her until now. It wasn't curiosity, it was suspicion. They were probing her like she was some stranger who had infiltrated their perfect circle instead of the woman who had been my anchor for years. At dinner, Ethan made sure to sit across from us, his eyes constantly flicking towards Sophia. Every time she spoke, he'd interrupt with a smug comment or a story about himself, steering the attention back to him. Olivia, too, couldn't stop glancing at Sophia with thinly veiled disdain, like she couldn't believe I had moved on, let alone with someone so poised and confident. When dessert came out, my mother made a point to hand Ethan the first slice of pie, her voice warm with affection. "You've been through so much, sweetheart. You deserve this." She didn't even acknowledge Sophia or me, like we were invisible. It was then that I realized something deeper than anger was settling inside me, a cold, calm understanding. I had always been the scapegoat, the expendable one, the one expected to roll over and accept whatever scraps were thrown my way. And maybe for years, I had done just that. But not anymore. As Ethan raised his glass in a mock toast, smirking across the table at me like he'd won some unspoken war, I caught Sophia's eye. She gave me the faintest nod, and I knew she understood what I was feeling. Something was shifting. The tension was building like a storm gathering on the horizon. And Ethan, smug, arrogant Ethan, had no idea what was coming. The evening stretched on, but instead of softening, the atmosphere grew sharper, like a knife pressed just under the skin. The conversations blurred around distant voices, clinking glasses, the scrape of silverware, but my focus stayed fixed on Ethan and Olivia. They seemed determined to make sure every second of my presence felt unwelcome. It started subtly enough. Olivia leaned in close to Ethan, whispering something that made him laugh just loud enough to draw attention. Then, like clockwork, his eyes would flick towards Sophia, gauging her reaction. When she stayed composed, he upped the ante. He told an embellished story about how he and Olivia had met, leaving out the betrayal, of course, and emphasized how meant to be they were, complete with that smug grin aimed in my direction. But the real breaking point came after dinner, when most of the family moved into the living room. My father's funeral should have been a time for grief and unity, yet Ethan couldn't resist turning it into another stage to gloat. He stood near the fireplace, holding his glass like a trophy, and with a sweeping gesture announced, "You know, Dad always said he was proud of me for finding someone as amazing as Olivia. He used to joke that she was the kind of woman you fight for." His eyes locked with mine, the words heavy with implication. Olivia smiled sweetly, but there was something victorious in it, a cruel little twist at the corner of her lips. "Your father adored us," she said, looking right at me, her voice dripping with false modesty. "He always said we were the future of the family." The room murmured in agreement, a few relatives nodding like it was gospel. My chest tightened, but before I could respond, Ethan delivered the blow that turned my stomach. "You know," he continued, his tone playful but edged, "back when Liam was with Olivia, Dad actually told me he thought they weren't right for each other. Said Liam always aimed too high. Guess he was right, huh?" The room erupted in awkward laughter. Some relatives chuckled nervously, others stayed silent, but the damage was done. Ethan had just stood there at our father's funeral and painted me as a man who couldn't measure up, implying that Olivia was too good for me, that I was too small, too weak, too unworthy. For years, I tolerated the favoritism, the comparisons, the quiet ways I was dismissed. But hearing Ethan drag our dead father's supposed words into his smug little performance, it broke something inside me. Sophia's hand tightened on my arm, a silent plea to stay calm, but the look in her eyes told me she felt the sting just as much as I did. And Olivia wasn't done twisting the knife. "I still remember when you proposed, Liam," she said suddenly, her voice carrying across the room. "It was sweet, really, but it never felt right. Ethan understood me in a way you just didn't. The casual cruelty of it stole the air from my lungs." She said it like she was reminiscing about an old memory, not tearing open the deepest wound of my life in front of an entire room of family. There was a moment of silence, then a few half-hearted chuckles from relatives, desperate to keep the mood light. My mother frowned, but nodded Olivia at me. "Liam, don't look so sour. Let them have their moment. It's not always about you, not always about me." At my father's funeral, the betrayal wasn't just Ethan and Olivia's anymore. It was my family's complicity, their silence, their laughter, their willingness to let me be humiliated for the sake of avoiding conflict. That was the moment I realized I couldn't trust any of them. Not with my dignity, not with my heart, not with anything. I swallowed hard, forcing my face into neutrality, though my insides roared with humiliation and rage. Sophia rubbed her thumb across the back of my hand, grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Not anymore. But the storm inside me had already broken. Something in me shifted permanently that night. I wasn't just the overlooked son anymore. I wasn't just the brother who had been betrayed. I was a man who had been pushed past his breaking point. And Ethan, my arrogant, self-satisfied brother, had no idea what I was capable of once I decided I had nothing left to lose. The night of the funeral gathering burned itself into my memory like a scar. By the time the last relative had shuffled out, offering Ethan and Olivia teary-eyed hugs and words of admiration, I felt like a ghost in my own family's house. No one asked if I was okay. No one checked in on me, their own son who had just buried his father. All the attention orbited Ethan as though he were the grieving hero, and I was nothing but a shadow at the edge of the room. I drove Sophia and myself home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. She didn't push me to talk. She never did. That was one of the things I loved most about her. She let me breathe, let me sit with the pain until I was ready to let it out. Still, I could feel her watching me, her quiet strength seeping into the cracks where I felt I was breaking. When we finally got home, I went straight to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the street lights filtering through the curtains. My chest felt heavy, like someone had stacked bricks on it. The words Ethan had spoken, "Dad always said Liam aimed too high," echoed over and over, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. The truth was, I had spent my whole life trying to prove myself in a family that never seemed to want me to succeed. I got good grades, worked steady jobs, and lived responsibly, but it was never enough. Ethan's smallest achievements were celebrated like triumphs, while mine barely earned a nod. And now, even in death, my father's memory was being weaponized against me. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of betrayal. Olivia's smirk, Ethan's gloating, my mother's dismissive scolding, the nervous chuckles from the room as they all let me be humiliated. It wasn't just one betrayal. It was years of being cast aside, all culminating in that one unbearable evening. For the next few weeks, I withdrew from everyone. I stopped answering calls from relatives. I didn't respond to texts that said things like, "Ethan is really struggling. You should check in on him," as though I had some responsibility to comfort the very person who had destroyed me. I buried myself in work, long hours at the office that left me exhausted enough to collapse into bed without thinking too much. Even Sophia, patient as she was, started to worry. "You can't let them keep doing this to you," she said one evening as we sat at the kitchen table. Her hand rested gently on mine, her eyes soft but steady. "They'll keep tearing you down if you give them the chance. You need to decide what's more important, their approval or protecting yourself." Her words hit hard because I knew she was right. For years, I had been desperate for scraps of recognition, even when it came at the cost of my dignity. But what had it ever earned me? A lifetime of being overlooked, mocked, and betrayed. Still, the pain was raw. I couldn't just flip a switch and be free of it. I walked around like a man carrying an invisible weight, one that made even simple tasks feel heavy. Grocery shopping, answering emails, even grabbing coffee with a colleague. It all felt hollow, like I was going through motions without any real purpose. One Saturday, I sat alone in the living room, flipping through an old photo album my mother had given me years ago. Page after page was filled with Ethan, his basketball games, his birthdays, his milestones. My pictures were sparse, small, tucked into corners like afterthoughts. For the first time, I didn't feel sadness when I saw the imbalance. I felt clarity. It hit me. I didn't belong to them, not really. I was their son, their brother, but I had never been treated like part of their story. I was the backdrop to Ethan's spotlight, and the only way to stop being cast as the supporting character was to step out of the play entirely. That night, I told Sophia I wanted distance, real distance from my family, from their drama, from the endless cycle of favoritism and betrayal. She nodded without hesitation. "Then we'll make that distance," she said simply. It wasn't a grand declaration of revenge, not yet. It was survival. It was choosing to breathe without their shadow choking me. But deep down, as I lay awake again that night, the beginnings of something sharper began to form. I didn't just want distance. I wanted them to know what it felt like to be invisible. I wanted Ethan, especially, to understand the emptiness he had shoved onto me all my life. And while I hadn't yet figured out how, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The next time Ethan tried to play his games, I wouldn't be the quiet brother in the background anymore. When I look back now, the months after my father's funeral were the darkest, but also the most defining. Walking away from my family left a hollow space inside me at first, an ache where duty and connection used to live. But that emptiness slowly transformed into something else, room to breathe. For the first time in my life, I had space to build something that wasn't constantly compared to Ethan. At first, I threw myself into work simply to numb the pain. I was a project manager at a mid-sized firm, good at my job, but never particularly ambitious. That changed almost without me realizing it. I stayed later at the office, took on extra projects, and started volunteering for the responsibilities others avoided. I thought I was just distracting myself, but in reality, I was sharpening skills, gaining confidence, and showing the higher-ups what I was capable of. Sophia was my quiet anchor through it all. Every night when I came home exhausted, She'd greet me with a soft smile and a meal waiting. She never complained about my long hours. Instead, she encouraged me. "You're building something," she'd say, her voice filled with a conviction I couldn't always find in myself. "One day, you'll look back and see how far you've come." That one day arrived sooner than I expected. 6 months after the funeral, my boss called me into his office. I assumed it was about another project deadline, but instead, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Liam, you've impressed a lot of people here. We want you to head up our new division." It was a promotion that came with more pay than I'd ever seen on a paycheck, a bigger office, and a team of my own to manage. For once in my life, I wasn't Ethan's brother or the quiet one. I was just Liam, and people respected me for who I was. With the promotion came financial freedom. Sophia and I moved out of our modest apartment into a house with wide windows and a backyard where she planted her dream garden. I bought a car that was mine and mine alone, not a hand-me-down, not a compromise. Every corner of that new life felt like a declaration. I didn't need their approval anymore. But the rise wasn't just financial. I started taking care of myself in ways I had neglected for years. I joined a gym, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I needed an outlet for all the energy I had buried inside me. The first few weeks were brutal, but soon I noticed the changes: stronger arms, more energy, clearer thoughts. Each drop of sweat felt like shedding a piece of my old self. I also found new circles of friends, people who knew me only as Liam, not as the brother who lived in Ethan's shadow. We hosted dinners, went hiking, and shared laughter that wasn't poisoned by old grudges or family politics. Sophia thrived, too, building her career and friendships. And together, we created a life where we lifted each other instead of competing. Still, even as I built this new life, the past lingered like an echo. I'd hear from distant relatives, occasionally short messages with a tone that suggested obligation rather than care. "Ethan and Olivia just bought a new place," one aunt texted me. "They're doing so well." Another sent me a photo of them at a family gathering, smiling with glasses raised. The subtext was always the same: Ethan is winning. Ethan is the favorite, and you're not here. The difference now was that those messages didn't cut me the way they once did. They stung, yes, but I no longer felt like I was drowning under the weight of them. Instead, they fueled something different, a resolve. Because while Ethan was busy basking in the same old family spotlight, I was building something real, something lasting, outside of their approval. 2 years into this new life, my success had grown to a point I never could have imagined back when I was suffocating under Ethan's shadow. I was leading major projects at work, my name appearing in industry articles. My income had tripled, Sophia's career was flourishing, and we traveled often Italy, Greece, the coastlines we'd always dreamed of seeing. And yet, the one constant in my mind was the look on Ethan's face at the funeral when Sophia walked into the room. The smugness fading, the confusion, the realization that for once, I had something he couldn't immediately belittle. That memory stayed with me, reminding me that one day, inevitably, our worlds would collide again. The thought didn't fill me with dread anymore. It filled me with a quiet anticipation because this time, I wasn't the brother who had been left behind. This time, I had power, success, stability, and a life worth protecting. And I knew, deep down, that Ethan and Olivia wouldn't be able to resist trying to tear it down. They never could stand my happiness. The question was, when they came for me again and I knew they would, how would I respond? It was about 3 years after the funeral when Ethan and Olivia found their way back into my life. By then, Sophia and I were settled into the rhythm of our new reality. I had moved beyond just surviving. I was thriving. Work was no longer just a job, but a career. With my division consistently outperforming others, my name had started to carry weight in the industry. And with that came invitations to conferences, partnerships, and a growing network of powerful contacts. One autumn afternoon, as I sat in my office reviewing quarterly reports, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. It was short, almost casual, but my stomach dropped when I read it. "Hey, Liam, it's Ethan. We should talk." I stared at the screen for a long moment, my jaw tightening. We hadn't spoken since that night at the funeral gathering, and the audacity of him reaching out like nothing had happened was almost laughable. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the better of me, and I typed back, "What do you want?" His reply came quickly. "Let's grab coffee. I've got something you'll want to hear." Sophia raised an eyebrow when I told her. "This smells like trouble," she said, setting down the book she'd been reading. You don't owe him anything. She was right. I didn't. But part of me wanted to see what angle he was playing this time. Not out of obligation, but strategy. I wasn't the same man who had once been blindsided by his betrayal. If Ethan thought he could manipulate me again, he was in for a surprise. We met a week later at a downtown cafe. Ethan walked in looking sharper than I remembered. Tailored suit, polished shoes, but there was something strained about his expression. He tried to mask it with charm, flashing the same grin that had always won people over, but I noticed the slight tightness around his eyes, the way his hands fidgeted before he extended one to shake mine. Liam, he said warmly, as though we were old friends. It's been too long. Not long enough, I replied evenly, though I gestured for him to sit. He chuckled like I'd made a joke. Fair enough. For a few minutes, we exchanged pleasantries, but then Ethan leaned forward, his voice dropping. Look, I'll get to the point. Things haven't been easy lately. He paused, glancing out the window before meeting my eyes. The business Olivia and I invested in. It's struggling. We've had some setbacks. I said nothing, waiting. He cleared his throat. You've done well for yourself, clearly. Word gets around. You're managing big projects, making good money. I was thinking maybe you could. He hesitated, then finally said it. God help us out. The audacity almost made me laugh. Ethan, the golden child, asking me for help. The same man who had once told me I aimed too high was now sitting across from me, admitting that his own reach had exceeded his grasp. I leaned back, studying him. Help you out how? Just a short-term loan, he said quickly. Nothing crazy. 50,000. We'd pay you back, of course. The old me, the one desperate for scraps of validation, might have considered it, might have thought this was an olive branch. But the man sitting across from him now knew better. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about convenience. Ethan needed something, and for once, he thought I might be useful. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I filed the information away, every detail a puzzle piece. Ethan and Olivia weren't invincible. Their perfect little life had cracks in it, and now I knew exactly where to press. Over the next few weeks, I started to dig quietly. I had contacts, now lawyers, financial advisors, people who knew how to look into businesses. What I learned confirmed my suspicions. Ethan and Olivia had sunk a large portion of their savings into a boutique real estate venture, one that was bleeding money. They'd leveraged nearly everything to make it work, betting big on their charm and connections, but the market had turned against them. They weren't just struggling, they were drowning. The knowledge gave me something I hadn't felt in years: control. For so long, Ethan had held the power, twisting it like a knife to remind me of my place. But now, the roles were shifting. I didn't rush. Patience was something I'd learned the hard way. Instead of acting immediately, I played the part of the hesitant brother. I met Ethan again, listened to his stories, and nodded sympathetically while he painted himself as the victim of bad luck. Olivia even called me once, her tone dripping with forced sweetness as she suggested we all get together as a family again. But beneath it all, I could feel the desperation. They needed me more than they wanted to admit, and I knew sooner or later, they'd push harder. Sophia noticed the change in me. One evening, as we walked through our garden, she asked, "You're planning something, aren't you?" I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I let a smile spread across my face. Not a forced one, not a mask, but a real smile. "Let's just say," I replied, "they handed me the leverage. Now it's just a matter of when and how." The storm that had once consumed me had become something else entirely. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing. The turning point came when Ethan called me late one evening, his voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. "Liam, please," he said, the desperation barely disguised. "If we don't get cash soon, the bank is going to seize the property. It'll ruin us." I sat in my office at home, staring at the city lights outside the window. I could hear Olivia in the background, her voice sharp, urgent, like she was scolding him for not convincing me faster. For the first time in my life, the power wasn't in their hands. It was in mine. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make him sweat, then said evenly, "I might be able to help, but not in the way you think." Ethan jumped at it, eager. "Anything. Just tell me what you need." What I needed was patience. Over the next few weeks, I invited Ethan and Olivia into carefully chosen conversations, meetings, and scenarios that painted me as their lifeline. I hinted at knowing investors who might be interested, at having contacts in real estate development who could provide guidance. Each breadcrumb pulled them deeper into believing I was their salvation. At the same time, I had my financial advisor quietly acquire a stake in their struggling venture. It wasn't hard. Records showed they were desperate for buyers, anyone willing to inject liquidity. Through a third party, we negotiated a deal that gave me controlling interest for a fraction of what it was worth on paper. They were too panicked to notice the fine print. I'll never forget the day we met at a sleek downtown office to sign papers. Ethan and Olivia walked in looking tired, their clothes immaculate but their faces strained. They were all polite smiles covering the cracks. "This is the break we needed," Ethan whispered to Olivia as he flipped through the documents. None the wiser. Liam came through. Sophia sat beside me, composed and unreadable, but I could feel her quiet satisfaction radiating like warmth. The moment Ethan's pen scratched his signature across the page, the trap snapped shut. I leaned back, folding my hands. "Congratulations," I said smoothly. "I'm now the majority owner of your company." The silence that followed was almost cinematic. Ethan froze mid-motion, his eyes darting over the papers as if they might change under his gaze. Olivia's face went pale, then flushed an angry red. What are you talking about?" Ethan stammered. I slid a copy of the agreement toward him, tapping the relevant clause. "Right here. You signed over controlling interest, which means every decision now runs through me." Olivia's voice rose, shrill. "This is manipulation. You tricked us." I met her glare with calm. "No, this is business. You came to me. You begged me for help. I gave you exactly what you asked for, just not in the way you expected." Ethan tried to argue, but the truth was in the ink on the page. His bravado cracked, replaced by something I had never seen in him before: fear. Over the following weeks, I tightened the reins. Their lavish expenses were cut off. I vetoed their pet projects, replaced their advisors with competent managers, and slowly stripped away the control they thought they'd never lose. Their names no longer carried weight at board meetings. Mine did. What made it satisfying wasn't the money or the power. It was watching Ethan squirm as the roles reversed. For once, he was the one being diminished, his voice dismissed, his decisions overruled. And every time he looked at me across the table, he saw the brother he had once written off as weak, now standing taller than he ever had. Olivia's bitterness only fueled the collapse. She tried to undermine me, whispering to investors, spreading rumors, but the contracts and financial records spoke louder than her words. Eventually, even their closest allies began to distance themselves, unwilling to tie their futures to a sinking ship. One evening, Ethan cornered me outside the office. His voice was low, broken. "Why are you doing this? You've already got everything: money, a wife, success. Why take this too?" I looked at him for a long moment, letting the weight of silence settle. Then I said quietly, "Because you never understood, Ethan. It was never about what you had. It was about what you took from me. Now you know how it feels." He had no answer, just a hollow stare, like a man realizing the game he thought he had mastered was finally being played by someone better. And for the first time in my life, I walked away from him without looking back, because now he was the one in the shadows. The collapse came faster than even I expected. Within 6 months, Ethan and Olivia's carefully curated image crumbled. Their lavish lifestyle, the big house, the flashy cars, the designer clothes, couldn't be sustained without the flow of money they once siphoned freely from the company. Now that I controlled it, every unnecessary expense was cut off. Investors who had once trusted Ethan began coming directly to me, bypassing him entirely. At meetings, his voice went unheard, his suggestions quietly ignored. The golden boy, who had been praised his entire life, was suddenly irrelevant. Olivia's attempts to claw back influence only made things worse. Her whisper campaigns failed. Her temper outbursts alienated what little support they had left. She'd spent years believing charm and entitlement could carry her, but in the world I now controlled, neither had value. The real breaking point came when the bank repossessed their home. Ethan called me late at night, his voice trembling. "They're taking the house, Liam. We have nowhere to go." I sat in my study, the papers stacked neatly before me, the evidence of their downfall written in numbers and signatures. For a brief moment, I thought of offering him a way out, some last shred of mercy. But then I remembered standing at my father's funeral, Ethan smirking, Olivia twisting the knife with her cruel words, my mother telling me not to be sour as I was humiliated in front of everyone. So, I said nothing. I simply let the silence stretch until Ethan whispered, "I guess you really won." Then the line went dead. Word spread quickly through the family. My phone lit up with messages from aunts, cousins, even my mother, please disguised as scolding. "You didn't have to be so harsh," she said during the one call I answered. Ethan is your brother. Blood is thicker than water. I let her finish before replying, calm but firm. Blood may be thicker than water, Mom, but respect is thicker than blood. And you all taught me that the hard way. For once, she had no comeback, just a faint exhale before the line clicked dead. In the months that followed, family gatherings became quieter. Ethan and Olivia stopped showing up entirely, too humiliated to face the people who had once applauded them. Slowly, relatives began shifting their tone with me, sending polite invitations, praising my achievements. But I didn't rush back into their arms. The years of neglect and betrayal weren't erased by a few forced smiles. Instead, I built my own gatherings with Sophia, with our friends, with people who celebrated without conditions. Laughter filled our home, genuine and untainted by competition or cruelty. And every time I looked at Sophia across the table, I felt a peace I had never known in my parents' house. One spring evening, as we stood on our porch watching the sun sink behind the trees, Sophia asked softly, "Do you ever regret it? Taking it all from them?" I thought about it for a long moment, the weight of the years behind me. Then I shook my head. No, they wrote the rules. I just played their game better. She slipped her hand into mine, and together we stood in the fading light, no words needed. Because in that silence, I realized the truth. For years, Ethan had defined me by what I lacked. His approval, my father's pride, Olivia's love. But in the end, it was Ethan who lost everything he thought made him untouchable. And me? I had gained more than I ever dreamed. Not just success, not just revenge. I had freedom. And that was the final victory.